Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can to help slow your spinning mind, enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you to drift away. But before you do fall asleep, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you'd like to support me to keep it going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. You can go along there and take a look at the fun bonuses that you get based on your contribution level. And if monthly is a bit much, you can put a tip in the tip jar. Both of these are linked in the show notes. And I need to give a shout out to some people who have given some support. Shout outs to Elle and Jennifer, who have signed up on the Patreon recently. And big thanks as well to both Craig and Betty, who threw something in the tip jar. Thanks very much to all of you. I'm very grateful for the support. And you can also support Sleepy Time Tales by simply spreading the word. If you know someone who's struggling to sleep, just tell them where to find it and see how it goes from there. And that's enough of that. Let's get back to Rome's wars against the Goths and the adventures of Belisarius and the Emperor Justinian. So snuggle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. Return once again to the Dark Ages by Charles Oman. Belisarius had reached the posting station of Ad Decimum and was advancing cautiously with strong corps of observation securing his flanks and front, when suddenly he was assailed by the whole force of the Vandals, who outnumbered him in at least a proportion of 2 to 1. He was beset on 3 sides at once. One corps of Vandals under the king's brother Amatus issued from Carthage to attack him in the front. Another body beset his left flank. The main army under Galamo himself assailed the rear of his long column of march. But the Vandals mismanaged their tactics and failed to combine the 3 attacks. First, the troops from Carthage came out and were beaten off with the loss of their leader. Then the turning corps was driven back by the Hunnish cavalry, whom Belisarius had kept lying out on his flank. When the main Vandal army came up, there was more serious fighting with the center and rear of the Roman column. Galamo furiously burst through the line of march and cleft the Roman army in twain, but he did not know how to use his advantage. Instead of improving his first success, he halted his troops and allowed Belisarius to rally and reform his men. It is said that he was so transported with grief at finding the corpse of his brother who had fallen in their earlier engagement that he gave no more orders and cast himself weeping on the ground. Presently the Romans were in good array again. The victorious vanguard had returned to aid the center, and they fell once more, as the evening closed in, on the stationary masses of the Vandals. The conquerors of Africa must have forgotten their ancient valor, for after a very paltry resistance they turned and fled westward, under cover of the night. Carthage at once threw open its gates, and Belisarius dined next day in the royal palace, on the meal that had been prepared for the Vandal king. Galamo reaped now the reward for the 100 years of persecution to which his forefathers had subjected the Africans. Every town that was not garrisoned opened its gates to the Romans, and the provincials hastened to place everything they possessed at the disposal of Belisarius. His entry into Carthage was like the triumph of a homecoming king, and the order and discipline of his troops was so great that none, even of the Vandal and Arian citizens, suffered loss. Galamo meanwhile retired into the Numidian hills, with an army that suffered more loss of morale than loss of numbers. He was soon joined by the troops whom he had sent to Sardinia. Having subdued that island, they returned, and raised his forces to nearly 50,000 men. Finding that Belisarius was repairing the walls of Carthage before marching out to finish the campaign, Geilemir resolved to take the offensive himself. Descending from the hills, he marched on Carthage and met the Roman army at Tricamaron, 20 miles westward of the city. Here Belisarius won a pitched battle after a struggle far more severe than he had gone through at Ad Decimum. Thrice the Romans were beaten back, but their gallant leader rallied them, and at last his cuirassiers burst through the Vandal ranks and slew Tsatso, the king's brother. Geilemir turned to fly, though his men fought on until their retreat was cut off. Almost the whole Vandal race perished in this fight, and the bloody pursuit which followed. Geilemir himself took refuge on the heights of Mount Atlas among the Moors, and dwelt among them miserably enough for a few months. Discovering that he could not raise a third army, and that life was unendurable among the filthy barbarians, he determined to surrender, and yielded himself and his family to Belisarius, on the assurance that he should receive honorable treatment, in spite of the fact that he had murdered the emperor's friend Hilderic. In the spring of 534, Belisarius was able to return in triumph to Constantinople, bringing with him the king and most of the surviving Vandals as captives. His ships were loaded with all the plunder of the palace of Carthage, the trophies of a century of successful pirate raids, including the plate and ornaments which Gaiseric had carried off from Rome in 455. It is said that the emperor recognized among the store the 7-branched candlestick and golden vessels of the Temple of Jerusalem, which Titus Caesar had taken to Rome when he conquered Judea 400 years back. He sent them to be placed in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the Holy City, where they had been first consecrated. Belisarius was allowed the honors of an ancient Roman triumph, a privilege denied to a subject for 4 centuries. He entered the Hippodrome in state, and laid his prisoners and his booty at Justinian's feet, while Senate and people saluted him as the next Scipio Africanus, a title which he had fairly earned. Next year he was promoted to the consulship and given every honor that the emperor could devise. His captive, King Geilemir, was kindly treated, and presented with a great estate in Phrygia, where he and his family long dwelt in ease. The year of the triumph of Belisarius saw new opportunities arising for him and for his master. In the autumn of 534 died the sickly and debauched youth who had held the title of King of the Ostrogoths. He had not yet attained his 18th birthday. His mother, Amalasuitha, was now left face to face with the wild Goths, stripped of the protection of the royal name, and exposed to the enmity of the families of the chiefs whom she had executed. In despair of inducing the Goths to endure the rule of a queen regnant, she determined to choose a colleague and confer on him the title of king. Theodoric's next male heir after Athalaric was a certain Theodahat, the son of his sister Amalberga. The prince had been excluded by his uncle from all affairs of state for his notorious cowardice, covetousness, and duplicity. He was a Romanized Teuton of the worst type, as was truly said, Vilis Scothus imitator Romanum. He had pronounced literary tastes, called himself a Platonic philosopher, and showed some care for the arts, but was wholly mean and corrupt. Amalsuintha thought to presume on the cowardice of her cousin, and to force him to become her tool. She forgot that even a coward may be ambitious. At the queen's behest, the assembly of the warriors of Italy hailed Theodahat, and Amalsuintha joint rulers of the Ostrogoths. But in less than 6 months the intriguing king had suborned his partisans to seize and imprison his unfortunate cousin. She was cast into a castle on the lake of Bolsena, and shortly afterwards murdered, with Theodahat's connivance by some of the kinsfolk of the nobles, whom she executed 5 years before. Justinian now had an even better casus belli in Italy than he had possessed in Africa. His ally had been dethroned and murdered, and her crown was possessed by a creature far inferior to Guillemere, who was at least a warrior, if an unfortunate one. The miserable Theodohat grovelled with fear when he received the angry ultimatum of Justinian. He even made secret proposals to the Empress ambassadors, to the effect that he would abandon his crown and betray his people, if only he were granted his life and a suitable maintenance. When even this did not avail, he took to consulting soothsayers and magicians. We're told that a Jewish seer bade him pen up 30 pigs, to represent unclean Gentiles, we must suppose, and 3 stars, calling 10 Goths, 10 Italians, and 10 Imperialists. He was to leave them 10 days without food or water, and then take augury from their condition. When Theodohat looked in at the appointed hour, he found that all the Goth pigs were dead save 2, and half of the Italians. But the Imperialists, though gaunt and wasted, were all, or almost all, alive. This the seer told the downcast king would portend a war, in which the Gothic race was to be well nigh exterminated, and the Italians to be terribly cut down, while the imperial armies would conquer after much toil and privation. While Theodohat was vainly busy with his soothsayers, the Roman armies had already attacked the Gothic province in Dalmatia. The wretched usurper had to face war, whether he willed it or no. Justinian had determined, as was but natural, to entrust the Ostrogothic war to the conqueror of Africa, and in the autumn of the year of his consulship, Belisarius sailed for the west with a small army of 7,500 men, of whom 3,000 were Isaurians, and the rest equally divided between Roman regulars and Hunnish and Herule auxiliaries. It was a small force with which to attack a king who commanded the swords of 100,000 gallant Germans, but reinforcements were to follow, and Theodohat's cowardice and incapacity were well known. In September 535, Belisarius fell on Sicily. Here, as in Africa, the provincials hastened to throw open the gates of their cities to the invader. There were few Goths in Sicily. They garrisoned Palermo, but Belisarius took the place by a sudden assault, after lying only a few days before its walls. By the approach of winter, the whole island was in his hands. He would have hastened on to attack Italy, but for a mutiny which broke out in Africa, and compelled him to cross the sea and spend some time in the neighborhood of Carthage. Meanwhile, the poor craven Theodohat did nothing but besiege the ears of Justinian with more fruitless proposals for peace. He was as unprepared as ever for resistance when Belisarius crossed over the Straits of Messina in April 536, and overran Bruttium and Lucania. So greatly were the Goths of the south discouraged by his helplessness, that Ebermund, the Count of Lucania, surrendered to Belisarius, and entered the imperial service with all his followers. It was not till he had pushed on to Naples that Belisarius met with any opposition. All through southern Italy the city gates swung open the moment that he touched them with his spear. The old Greek city of Naples, however, held by a strong Gothic garrison, made a very obstinate defense, and held out for many weeks, awaiting the arrival of a relieving army. King Theodohat had gathered a great army at Rome, but the coward dared not close, and kept 50,000 men idle, while 7,000 Romans were beleaguering Naples. At last the city fell, a party of Isaurian soldiers having found their way up a disused aqueduct, and stormed one of the gates from within. The news of the fall of Naples raised the wrath of the Goths against their wretched king to boiling point. At a great folk-moot at Regita in the Pomptine marshes, the army solemnly deposed Theodohat, and as no male Amal was left, raised on the shield of Witiges, an elderly warrior of respectable character, who had won credit in the old wars of Theodoric. The dethroned king fled away to seek refuge at Ravenna, but a private enemy pursued him and cut his throat like a sheep, Ere long he had reached the city of the marshes. The choice of Wittigers was a fearful error on the part of the Goths. They had mistaken respectability for talent, and paid the penalty in seeing the stupid veteran wreck all their hopes. The first blunder on the part of the new king was to draw his army northward, on the news that the Franks were crossing the Alps to ravage the valley of Po. He left only 4,000 men in Rome, and marched on Ravenna with all the rest. The moment that he was departed, Belisarius moved northward to attack the imperial city. It fell into his hands without a blow. The Gothic garrison felt that they were left deserted among a populace ready to betray them to the enemy. Indeed, Pope Silverius and the Senate had already written to pray Belisarius to deliver them. When the imperialists appeared before the southern gate, the Goths fled out of the northern, in a panic that was inexcusable, for they were well nigh as numerous as the 5,000 men that Belisarius brought with him. Belisarius was now master of Rome, but he knew that his hold on it was precarious. Wittigers had settled matters with the Franks by paying them 130,000 gold solidi, and ceding his Transalpine dominions in Provence. After marrying Mattiswintha, the sister of the late King Athalaric, and the last scion of the house of the Amals, he resolved to return and deliver Rome. All North Italy had sent him its Gothic warriors, and 100,000 men marched under his banner to besiege Rome in the spring of 537. The defense of Rome is the greatest of all titles to glory that Belisarius won. The walls of Aurelian were strong, but there were only 5,000 men to defend its vast circuit, and within was an unruly mass of cowardly citizens, liable to all sorts of panic fears, mouths to be fed without hands to strike, for hardly a Roman took arms to aid the imperial troops. In the middle of March, the Goths appeared before the walls, and pitched 7 camps opposite the northern and eastern gates of the city. They then cut all the aqueducts which supplied Rome with water, and commenced the construction of siege engines for a great assault. With the want of thoroughness that he always displayed, King Witiges made no adequate preparation for blockading the southern side of the city, or for stopping its communications with Ostia and Naples. All through the siege, convoys of provisions and reinforcements were frequently able to creep into Rome by night, eluding the outposts which were all that Witiges placed on the side of the Tiber and the Campania. A fortnight after arriving in front of the walls, Witiges had his engines ready and delivered his great assault on the northern and northeastern fronts of the city. Everywhere the attack failed. The towers and rams which the Goths had drawn forward never reached the walls. The oxen which drew them were shot down before they neared the ditch. But thousands of wild warriors with scaling ladders delivered assaults against innumerable portions of the enceinte. In most cases, they failed entirely. The walls of Aurelian were too strong. But at 2 points, at opposite ends of the city, they nearly won success. At the Praenestine Gate, a battering ram broke in the outer bulwarks, and a swarm of Goths were only held back by an inner entrenchment till the reinforcements of Belisarius arrived. But greater danger still was encountered at the mausoleum of Hadrian, the castle of St. Angelo, just beyond the Aelian Bridge. There the Goths filled the ditch, overwhelmed the defenders with arrows, and were fitting their ladders to the embrasures, when they were at last checked by a strange expedient. The walls of the mausoleum were lined with dozens of splendid statues, some of them figures of emperors, others the ancient spoils of Greece. At the supreme moment, the desperate garrison flung these colossal figures on the besiegers below, and drove them off by the hail of marble fragments. At the end of the day, Belisarius was everywhere successful. 20,000 Goths had fallen, and the self-confidence of Witiges was so broken that he had never again tried a general assault. He relied instead on a blockade, but though he inflicted great misery on the garrison and still more on the populace, he never closed the roads or the river sufficiently to exclude occasional convoys of provisions. He did not prevent Belisarius from transferring to Campania the greater part of the women, aged men, and slaves in the city. Meanwhile, the summer drew on, and the Gothic hosts began to suffer from malaria and from the filthy state of the crowded camps. On the other hand, Belisarius at last began to receive reinforcements from Constantinople, and was able to make sallies in which his horsemen handled the Gothic outposts very roughly. When both assault and blockade had proved ineffectual, and when an attempt to creep into the city through the empty aqueducts had been foiled, Witigis would probably have done well to raise the siege and throw on Belisarius, whose army was still very small, the burden of taking the offensive. Instead of doing this, he lay obstinately in his camp for 1 year and 9 days, watching his army melt away under the scourge of pestilence, and allowing the numbers and boldness of the imperialists to increase. At last Belisarius had been so strongly reinforced that he was able, while still holding Rome, to put a second force in the field. This he sent under an officer named John the Bloody, through the Sabine hills to make a dash into Picenum and menace Ravenna. John, a very able officer, seized the important town of Rimini, only 33 miles from Ravenna, in February 538. The news that his capital was being threatened and that the enemy was in his rear at last forced the sluggish king of the Goths to move. He set his 7 camps on fire and retired up the Flamian Way into Picenum. Thus the prudence and valor of Belisarius were at last vindicated, and the Romans, after a siege of 374 days, could once more breathe freely. Middle Italy was now lost to the Goths, and the scene of operations shifted into Picenum, north of Etruria, and the valley of the Po, where the war was to endure for 2 years more, 538 to 540. It resolved itself into a struggle for the coastal towns between Ravenna and Ancona, and for the command of the passes of the Apennines. One half of the Roman army was concentrated at Rimini and Ancona, while Belisarius himself, with the other, was occupied in clearing the Gothic garrisons out of northern Etruria. 2 Gothic armies at Ravenna and Auximum pinned the northern Roman force into the narrow seacoast plain, and at last laid siege to both Rimini and Ancona. Here Witigis seemed for once likely to succeed, but when the garrisons had been brought to the last extremity, they were relieved by new forces from Constantinople, commanded by the eunuch Narses, the Praepositus Sacri Cubiculi. Thrown on the defensive, Witigis drew back to Ravenna, and allowed the Romans to overrun the province of Aemilia, and even to cross the Po, and raise an insurrection in the great city of Milan. There now followed a long pause. Belisarius found that Narses was set on asserting an independent authority over the newly arrived army, and had to send to the emperor to beg him to recall the eunuch. Meanwhile, he laid siege to the last 2 Gothic fortresses south of Ravenna, the towns of Fisolia in Etruria and Auximum in Picenum. Both cities made a gallant resistance, and while Belisarius was at a standstill, Urias, the warlike nephew of Witigis, stormed and sacked Milan, and restored the Gothic dominion north of the Po. Meanwhile, the king took the only wise step which occurred to him during the whole war. He sent ambassadors to the east to inform Chosroes, king of Persia, that well nigh the whole Roman army was occupied in Italy, and that he might overrun Syria and Mesopotamia with ease. Taken 2 years earlier, this step might have saved the Goths, but now it was too late. Chosroes moved, but only in time to hear that Witigis was dethroned and a captive. After holding out 7 months, Auximum surrendered to Belisarius at midwinter, 539-540. Witiges had done nothing to save the gallant garrison, alleging that a Frankish raid into the valley of the Po prevented him from moving. The excuse was true, but insufficient, for when the Franks of Theudebert, thinned by disease, turned home again, the Gothic king did not stir any the more. At last, in the spring of 540, Narses had been recalled, and Belisarius had full possession of all Pacinum and Etruria, and could safely advance on Ravenna. After posting a covering force to ward off any attempt to relieve the town by the Goths of northern Italy, he drew his main army around the great fortress in the marshland, the chosen home of Theodoric, the storehouse of the hoarded wealth of the Amals. The defense was weak, far weaker than that of the smaller stronghold of Auximum. Witiges seemed to have the power of communicating his sloth and hesitation to all who came near him. He listened first to offers from Theudebert the Frank, then to proposals for surrender sent in by Belisarius. At last he determined to close with the terms offered by Justinian, that he should resign all Italy south of the Po, give up half the royal hoard, and reign in the Transalpine as the emperor's vassal. The terms were not hard, for Justinian had just been attacked by Persia, and wished to end his Italian war at once. It would have been well for all parties if they had been carried out, but two wills intervened. The Gothic nobles were wildly indignant at their master's cowardice. Belisarius, looking at his military advantages, thought the terms too liberal. From this discontent came an extraordinary result. The Teutonic chiefs boldly proposed to the imperial general that he should reign over them. Whether as king of the Goths or Roman Caesar, they cared not. But their swords should be his, and the craven Witiges should be cast away, if he would take them as his vassals and administer Italy. Belisarius temporized, and the simple Goths, believing that no man could resist such an offer, threw open the gates. But the great general was loyal to the core. Instead of proclaiming himself emperor, he took over the town in Justinian's name, bade the Gothic warriors disperse each to his own home, and shipped all the golden stores of Ravenna off to Constantinople. It seemed as if the monarchy of the Goths was ended. Nothing remained to them save Pavia, Verona, and a few more North Italian cities. Justinian resolved to recall Belisarius before these places should fall. Meaner generals would suffice to take them. Two motives stirred the emperor. His great captain was wanted on the eastern frontier to keep back the advancing Persian, but suspicion also played its part. Justinian was not too well pleased that Belisarius had overruled his project of making peace with Witiges, and he had been somewhat frightened by the Gothic proposal to make Belisarius emperor. It had been declined, it is true, but might not the seeds of disloyalty have sunk into the heart of the general? It would be safer to bring him away from the temptation. So, by the imperial mandate, Belisarius sailed for the Bosphorus, taking with him the captive Witiges and all the gold and gems of the great hoard of the Amals. He was denied a formal triumph such as he had won by his Vandal victory, but nonetheless his reception was magnificent. His personal bodyguard of 7,000 chosen men had followed him to the capital, and as they passed through the streets the populace exclaimed, "The household of one man has destroyed the kingdom of the Goths." Happy it would have been for the great general if he had died at the moment of this, his grandest success. He was reserved for lesser wars and years of checkered fortune. Chapter 6. Justinian continued, 540 to 565 AD. The year 540 was the last of Justinian's years of unbroken good fortune. For the rest of his long life he was to experience many vicissitudes, and see some of his dearest schemes frustrated. Though on the whole, the dogged perseverance which was his most notable characteristic brought him safely through to the end. The first difficulty which was destined to trouble him in the latter half of his reign was a financial one. He had now come to the end of the hoarded wealth of Anastasius. The military budget of his increased empire required more money, for Africa and Italy did not pay their way, and now a new Persian war was upon his hands. In addition, his magnificent court and his insatiable thirst for building called for huge sums year after year. It is impossible to exaggerate Justinian's expenditure on bricks and mortar. Not only did he rebuild in his capital, on a more magnificent scale, all the public edifices that had been burnt in the Nika riot, but he filled every corner of his empire, from newly conquered Ravenna to the Armenian frontier, with splendid forts, churches, monasteries, hospitals, and aqueducts. Whenever a Byzantine ruin is found in the wilds of Syria or Asia Minor, it turns out, in one case out of every two, to be of Justinian's date. In the Balkan Peninsula alone, we learn to our surprise that he erected more than 300 forts and castles to defend the line of the Danube and the Haemus, the side of the empire which had been found most open to attacks of the barbarian during the last century. The building of his enormous cathedral of St. Sophia alone cost several millions, an expenditure whose magnificent result quite justifies itself, but one which must seem heart-rending to the financiers, who had to find the money at a moment when the emperor was involved in two desperate wars. Justinian poured forth his treasures with unstinting hand in the arts of both war and peace. But to replenish his treasury, that jar of the Danaides, he had to impose a crushing taxation on the empire. His finance minister, John of Cappadocia, was the most unscrupulous of men, one who never shrank from plying extortion of every kind upon the wretched taxpayers. As long as he kept the exchequer full, Justinian winked at his iniquitous and often illegal proceedings. It was only when he chanced to quarrel with the Empress Theodora that John was finally disgraced. His successors were less capable, but no less extortionate. Ere 10 years had passed, the Africans and Italians, groaning under the yoke of the Greek Logothetes, were cursing their stars that they had ever aided Belisarius to drive out the Arian, Goth, and Vandal. As Justinian's reign went on, the state of matters grew worse and worse, for a crushing taxation tends to drain the resources of the land, and at last renders it unable to bear even a burden that would once have been light. Historians recapitulate 20 new taxes that Justinian laid upon the empire, yet at the end of his reign they were bringing in far less than the old and simpler imposts of Anastasius and Justin had produced. This ruinous draining of the vital power of the empire only began to be seriously felt after 540, when for the first time Justinian was compelled to wage war at once in east and west, and yet refused to slacken from his building. The Gothic War, contrary to all probability and expectation, was still destined to run on for 13 years more. The Persian lasted for 16, and when they were over, the emperor and empire alike were but the shadow of their former selves. They were unconquered, but drained of all their strength and marrow. We've already mentioned that the young king Khosroes of Persia, stirred up by the embassy of Witigis, and dreading lest the power which had subdued Carthage and Rome should ere long stretch out its hand to Cephalon, had found a casus belli, and crossed the Mesopotamian frontier. Some blood feuds between Arab hordes respectively subject to Persia and Constantinople, and a dispute about the suzerainty of some tribes in the Armenian highlands, formed a good enough excuse for renewing a war at a moment where Justinian's best general and 50,000 of the flower of his troops were absent in Italy and Africa. In the spring of 540, at the very moment when Belisarius was reducing Ravenna, Khosroes marched up the Euphrates, leaving the frontier fortresses of Daras and Edessa on his flank, and launched a sudden attack on North Syria. He had been expected not there but in Mesopotamia, and all preparations for defense were out of gear. Before any resistance was organized, Khosroes had crossed the Euphrates, sacked Beroea, and ransomed Hierapolis for 2,000 pounds of gold. But it was at Antioch, the third city of the Roman Empire, and the seat of the Praetorian prefect of the East, that the Persian monarch was aiming. It was more than 2 centuries and a half since the city of the Orontes had seen a foreign foe, and its walls were old and dilapidated. A garrison of 6,000 men was thrown in, and the blues and greens of the city armed themselves to guard the ramparts. But there was no Roman army in the field to protect the city from the approach of the Persian. Buzes, the general of the East, refused to risk his small army in a general engagement, and retired no one knew whither. The siege of Antioch was short, for the defense was ill-managed. The garrison cut its way out when the walls were forced, but the town, with all its wealth and a great number of its inhabitants who had not found time to fly, became the prize of Khosroes. The Persian plundered the churches, burnt the private houses, and drove away a herd of captives, whom he took to his home, and established in a new city near Ctesiphon, which he called Khosrow Antiocheia. The great king then ransomed the neighboring cities of Chalcis and Apamea, and recrossed the Euphrates into Mesopotamia. Here, where strong and well-armed fortresses blocked his way, Khosroes found that he could effect nothing. After looking at Edessa, he found it too strong, and made his way to Daras. To this town he laid siege, but was beaten off without much difficulty, and then returned home for the winter in 540. The Persians were never destined to win again such successes as had fallen to them in this, the first year of the war. By the next spring, Justinian had reinforced the eastern frontier with all his disposable troops, and the mighty Belisarius himself had arrived to take command of the army of Mesopotamia. But it was not fated that the great king and the great captain should ever measure themselves against each other. Hearing that the frontier to the south was now well guarded, the Persian had resolved to make a dash at a new point of the Roman line of defense. While expected on the Euphrates, he quietly marched north through the Median and Iberian mountains, crossing many obscure passes, and appeared on the Black Sea coast by the river Phasis. The Romans here held the shore by the great castle of Petra, while the Lazzi, the tribes of inland Colchis, were Roman vassals. Khosroes overran the land, constrained the Lazzi to do him homage, and after a short siege took Petra. Meanwhile, Belisarius, on finding the Persian invasion of Mesopotamia delayed, had crossed the frontier in the far south, beaten a small Persian force in the field, and ravaged Assyria from end to end, though he could not take the great fortress of Nisibis. On hearing of this raid, Khosroes returned from Colchis with his main army, whereupon Belisarius retired behind the ramparts of Daras. The campaign had not been eventful, but the balance of gain lay on the side of the Persians, whose frontier now touched the Black Sea. Nor was the next year destined to see any decisive fighting. Belisarius had concentrated his army at Europus on the Euphrates and waited to be attacked. But save one raid, no attack came, though Khosroes had brought the full force of his empire up to Nisibis. The Roman chronicles ascribe his sluggishness to a fear of the reputation of Belisarius, but another cause seems to have been more operative. The Great Plague of 542 had just broken out in Persia, and its ravages were probably the real cause of the retreat and disbanding of the army of Khosroes, much as in 1348 the Black Death caused English and French to drop for a time their mutual hostilities. This awful scourge merits a word of notice. It broke out in Egypt early in the year and spread like wildfire over Syria, the lands of the Euphrates Valley and Asia Minor. thence making its way to Constantinople in the west. It is impossible to make out its exact nature, but we know that it was accompanied by ulcers and by a horrible swelling. Few whom it struck down ever recovered, but of these few was Justinian himself, who rose from his bed when the rumor of his death was already abroad, and a fight for the succession imminent. At Constantinople the plague raged with such violence that 5,000 and even 10,000 persons are said to have died in a single day. The historian Procopius marveled at its universal spread. A man might climb to the top of a hill, and it was there, or retire to the depths of a cavern, but it was there also. It took no note of north or south, Greek or Persian, washed or unwashed, winter or summer, and all alike it was deadly. This awful scourge, which is thought to have carried off a third of the population of the empire, was not the least of the causes of that general decay which is found in the later years of Justinian's reign. It swept away taxpayers, brought commerce to a standstill, and seems to have left the emperor himself an old man before his time. The plague then sufficiently accounts for the stagnation of the war in 542. Perhaps we may also allow something for the personal troubles of Belisarius, who in the previous winter had fallen on evil times. He had detected his intriguing wife Antonina in unfaithfulness, and for throwing her into a dungeon and kidnapping her paramour, had incurred the wrath of Theodora, which seriously handicapped him in the rest of his career. So great was her influence with her imperial spouse, he was no longer supported from Constantinople as he once had been, and was at last compelled to disarm Theodora's displeasure by liberating his wife. Imperial ill humor may perhaps have stinted his resources during the summer that followed his domestic misfortune. And on that embarrassing note for poor Belisarius, I'm going to call it a night. You can, as always, pick up where I'm leaving off by finding the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.